Hey, I'm Tony.
I'm Craig.
And we're coming to you from the corner of a pub.
As the sun was setting o'er the bright meadows all shining, a rebel hand set the head.
Here we are back in the old place.
Yes, sir.
All right. We've taken on a lot of things over our burgers and chips anyway, so I feel like we've already taken on most of the world's problems.
Most of them. Well, so let's go back to one of them that we were talking about, and that was I was telling you I was watching, not watching. I was listening to this radio show. I borrowed someone else's truck and turned the radio on, and it was this discussion this woman was having with these two pastors out in California, and they were talking about the difficulties they were facing with Gavin Newsom and the ways he was and for all the different arbitrary, no, I guess arbitrary is not the right word for it, but we'll say tyrannical orders he was making for their state, and say, we couldn't meet in our building. We had to get a warehouse, and they're expressing concern for things that are going to be coming up. They expect they're going to come up in the future in terms of mandated vaccines and people coming around your house to make sure that you and everyone in your home has received the vaccine.
So cool.
And there's this grave concern for this whole thing. And I'm thinking, what do you worry about? They're going to come around to your home. So what? They show up at your house. No one can make you say or do anything.
What was it you said earlier? Just say no.
Just say no.
Yeah.
All right. So, that's one of those things where people assume that there is authority where there is none.
Yeah.
And so that gets us into the topic of nullification. And nullification is an idea of I looked up I found a good definition that there's a couple different ways you could talk about nullification in terms of states nullifying federal laws or federal acts that actually carry no weight because they're unconstitutional. So you can have a state that says, hey, we don't recognize this federal law as law. You guys passed this, but the Constitution says you have no authority, and right. It's null, it's void here in whatever state it is, and that has happened, and that's an amazing thing. But I think that's too narrow, too specific, because can a state government be tyrannical? Well, yeah, just Gavin Newsom for sure, Greg Abbott for sure.
Yeah.
There's one definition I found I really liked. It was any act or acts that results in a law being void or unenforceable in a given area. And then this can happen in various ways. So it can happen, like we said, through the states going and telling the federal government, nope, not happening, not here. You don't have the authority. We don't recognize it. We're not playing. A sheriff can even step in, and that happened in the 90s. There was a really notable case where Sheriff Richard Mack in Arizona, he was the first to file this lawsuit against the federal government. It was the Clinton administration. He filed suit because that's when they had the Brady bill, and they actually ordered all the sheriffs to assist in enforcing the Brady bill. And
I forgot about that.
Yeah. And so there was going to be, if you didn't comply, I think they said, it's one of those things that sounds so bizarre. You think I must be making this up, but I'm pretty sure he said that you could even be jailed or charged for not assisting with it, not going along with it.
Nice.
And so there's also things that they were going to make the sheriffs do without compensating them for it. So, hey, you got to take your local money that you get from your county commissioners and you have to use it to enforce this federal bill. We're not going to reimburse you for any of it. And I said, no, you don't get to do that. And I think he said like 7 other sheriffs got on board with him. Only one.
That was it? Only 7?
Yeah. And of those 7, only 1 was from Texas. Even Richard Max is like, I still can't get over that. Only 1 was from Texas.
Wow.
But they sued the federal government and went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they won. He said he's like one of the only people to ever sue the Clintons and win and live to tell about it.
Yeah, no kidding.
So you got the states, you got sheriffs, you have the always unpopular jury nullification, which is, I mean, that's. There's some that might think that's a bit of a controversial thing, but I think that's a completely valid.
If you do a Google on CNN nullification, a ton of it is jury nullification.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
No kidding.
So that was actually pretty impressive.
Very cool. I mean, that's a valid one. And then it gets right down also to the individual's ability to nullify something. And you can see this played out whether it's in something as simple as a mask mandate. You know, there's people walking around and think that we have a law in Texas saying that you have to wear a mask.
Yeah, it's not a law at all, but they don't understand the difference because, generations of high school students have been taught such a low key, shallow version of how anything works. They have no idea that his order, for anybody listening, the Texas order for mask order, they think it's a law. Oh, you're breaking the law. You're not wearing a mask. It's not a law. As a matter of fact, that means they didn't even read the order because the order just says, hey, if you can't social distance, you're going to need to wear a mask.
Right.
I'm an introvert. I have never had a problem social distancing in my life.
And to be clear, when it comes to private businesses, we're not arguing with their ability to say, hey, you have to wear a mask.
No, that's their business. Do what you want.
Yeah.
You built it.
What goes along with that is that I went into a restaurant with someone recently, and they said, yeah, I think you have to wear a mask in here. I said, no, you don't have to until they make you. Just because they have a sign up doesn't really mean a whole lot. Because I've had one store in the last couple of months that I've gone into that has actually said, hey, I'm sorry, but if you don't have one, they actually refuse service. That's fine. I have no problem with that. I wasn't angry or anything. But a bunch of other stores that have big signs up at the front doors, no, even managers have confirmed, no, we're not refusing business.
Yeah, it's just in case somebody makes a news hype that it happened here, look, we mitigated what we needed to. Like we put out the things that we had to do to say, oh, no, we were trying to be safe and healthy. That's all that is.
Yeah. And a buddy of mine was telling me the other day that apparently the CDC put out their new guidelines, encourages businesses to not confront people not wearing masks. Because for like their own safety, their own welfare.
The CDC only has one crayon in their box, and it's gray.
Yeah, man. So everyone needs to wear a mask. Stores should have these mask policies. Don't enforce them. It is better for your health, which is kind of carries with it the suggestion that everyone not wearing a mask is just, a hair away from becoming violent towards anyone who confronts them.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're already called an anti-masker. You've already been labeled. But let's take it back to California for a minute. So, yes, they've been dealing with tyrannical things. And I hate to say it, there's no other reason. Like, this harkens back. Anything similar to this happens back in England under that kind of rule. It happens under fascism of the 20th century, And again, in every historical context, it has the facade of this is beneficial. This is for the greater good, which means we get to just shove this through, right? And in this case, you've got churches starting to fight back, saying, no, you don't have the right to do that. We're doing everything safe we can. And so this idea of nullification, what happens if just a million people in California said no, we're going to be safe, we're going to be smart, but no, we're going to keep moving on. What are you going to do to 1 million people?
Right.
Go lock them up?
Right.
What if how about we just go out? What about just if 10,000 businesses do this? Now that puts pressure on the government to go, how are we going to respond? Are we going to respond with blatant contradiction of what everything we're supposed to supposedly stand for as a country is? Or are we going to realize we overstepped? I mean, we don't mind it when it's marijuana usage, apparently. I mean, it's still illegal federally, but we don't mind when states are like, you know what, we're tired of that. We're not going to do that. So why are we drawing the line now on, hey, you can't go to church in California. You go to Walmart, you can't go to church. Mm-hmm. And so I guess that's the thing. But when you Google nullification, when you go and look at it, even Wikipedia, it's listed as nothing but a theory. It's what it is. It's a theory. And it's a theory based on the compact theory. So it's a theory on a theory when you read them. So the compact theory is that the states went into a compact together to make the federal government. And so with that said, it's a theory saying, hey, since we went on this, this deal together, we can nullify what we think violates the deal. And it's just a theory. And then when you go any further, you read about the nullification crisis. And stop me if I'm telling you something you already know on this, but the nullification crisis is referred to back in 1832 and 1833 when something that started under John Quincy Adams' tariff they felt like it unfairly impacted people in South Carolina, so they said they were going to nullify it. They were not going to.
Right. They
thought it exceeded the constitutional authority because Andrew Jackson came in and didn't do anything about it. So the problem is that it was used then, and of course they went back and forth. They had an enforcement bill come out, and then to answer the ordinance of nullification, and they had the compromise tariff, and then the South Carolina Convention also nullified the force bill just as a symbolic principle. But all these things are saying that, these are just theories. It's not there. But there's so much writing from even the original founders of the nation, even the Federalist guy himself, the biggest contributor, Madison, even he wrote a lot about this. But when you Google this, everything I see is like, it's just a theory, or it's a code word for Southern racism. I mean, it's just something like off the wall.
Yeah. So that's one of the real common ones, that whole racism issue. And when in fact it was actually used to combat slavery. So they had the Fugitive Slave Act that required if a slave escaped from a southern state into a northern state, a free state, they could be extradited from there and returned to someone that claimed to be their owner. And so the northern states would utilize nullification to say, no, this is an unjust law. It's not, there's no constitutional authority for you to take a person out of here and remove them. And so this was actually used to protect people and to combat unjust and unconstitutional federal acts. So that was actually a federal law, the Fugitive Slave Act.
Yeah, wasn't it Wisconsin? I want to say it was somewhere way up there that said, hey, no, we're not doing that.
Yep, it was Wisconsin. A man named Joshua Glover, who had been a slave. He escaped, made it up into Wisconsin. Wow. And a slave catcher went up there, found him, arrested him, and took him to a jail. And he was going to be brought into court. And, the name of the guy that the other part of this escapes me right now, but basically he was Sherman Booth was his name, and he was a newspaper man from the area. Yeah. And he starts printing out these handbills to pass around saying, this is what's going on, this is injustice that's going on, we need to stop this. And then the time's just drawing near to where they're about to take Joshua Glover out of Wisconsin. And he starts riding his horse through the street, stopping at all these major intersections, yelling, a man's liberty is at stake. And that's how he's calling people and rallying them. And they went into if I remember correctly, they went into the jailhouse and they demanded he be released. And when they wouldn't release him, they broke Joshua Glover out.
Wow.
So then they tried to charge Sherman Booth for inciting this whole thing. And I think it was the feds demanded that he be turned over. And Wisconsin stepped in every time. So you don't have authority to do that.
Yeah.
So the idea of nullification in that terms is that it's a state's duty to step in, to interpose when the federal government overreaches its authority. So it's a state recognizing, hey, and it gets into that idea of the compact. We agreed to these terms. You don't get to go outside these terms.
But that's the thing, though, is I guess it goes back to everybody turning back to that same Supreme Court to go, hey, you tell us what's okay. I mean, heck, this is the same court that can't decide what a human is since the very first day. And yet we're like, oh, it'll make the laws and uphold the laws that come from Congress that'll make everything fair. No, accountability does. And like you've said several times, this idea of the federal government deciding if what the federal government is fair is totally fair. No, I don't think so. So I have to give credit to you for one of the things you've given to me, Tom Wood's Nullification. Really, really love that. How it puts a lot of the primary resources together and everything there. And there's something that stuck out to me because when was this written? This was written a while back. I actually have a copy here in front of me. Let me see here. This was written back in, good grief, 2010.
Okay.
2010. So, and here's how relevant it is. He goes on and talks about there seems to be likewise a sense when matters of great importance are rushed through Congress on the spurious grounds that desperate times call for reckless measures. And he goes on to list NAFTA, the World Trade Organization, the bailout of the peso, the Patriot Act, the Wall Street bailouts, and the fiscal stimulus bill of 2009, only to name a few. And I'm thinking this predated all the whole pandemic stuff that came. Mm-hmm. And yet, look at the pandemic bailouts. Look at all the pandemic decision making and precedents that were set in just a 100-day period. And it was great to finally see some areas like South Dakota and them just say, nah, we're not doing that.
Right.
And watch,
right.
We'll be fine. We do have the science. We do have the math. We're not idiots because we don't just follow you blindly. We're going to stand. And what's great? These places are doing fantastic. They're not doing any worse than anybody else.
Right. Right.
And what's crazy though is it didn't take 1 million or 10,000. We're using these examples that are making a profound effect, and it was only a few people, a few leaders that stepped up and said, no, we will not go down that path.
Right. Right. And so, those are good examples of modern day, the state stepping in, and that's the general idea of it on a state to federal level, and so I think it's really valuable because that protects the people in that state, and that's what the 10th Amendment says. It's that all powers not delegated to the federal government remain with the states and the people therein. And so it's saying that it has to be delegated in the Constitution to those people, to the federal government, that they have these powers. Anything outside of that remains in the states and to the people therein.
Right.
And that was one thing that people concerned about the Constitution were they need to see something like that in there. Some argued, well, it's obvious because the wording of the Constitution. They said, no. We recognize that there is it's almost a certainty that the power that's given to this federal government is going to be abused, and they're going to reach past it. So having language like that is going to be one mechanism people will have to be able to safeguard against them. And then when it came down to in 1798, when you had things like the Alien Sedition Acts, where if you're just writing and you're putting the office of the president in some sort of pale light, now you can be charged with sedition. And so you have Madison and Jefferson start writing to each other, and Madison says that the states are duty bound to interpose and to step in there.
Yeah, I want to show you some irony about that here in a little bit.
Okay.
of what happened in that same area, just a little bit more recently in time, just here in a little bit, but I don't want to take you away from where you're at. So where you're going with this then, you've already taken it on. So everything I Google, everything I look at, because I will tell you, nullification as a formal concept, it was already there in my thinking. I didn't have a agreed upon terminology for it. It was already there in my thinking, though, to say, if it's beyond the bounds of what should happen, if it's just plain wrong, then continue to move forward and ignore it. It doesn't need to be there. So, and apparently Tom Woods felt the same way in that book that you recommended. He said the concept is there for a lot of people. They don't know the name. But everything I research, everything I've listened to over the years, everything is, that general welfare part, we can do what we need to for the general welfare of the public.
Yeah.
And it's so misused over and over and over. So what do you say to those that say that nullification was highly talked about as a justification for the southern states in the Civil War and how it ignores the general welfare cause? How would you approach that in a conversation then?
The argument that it was the southern state. Say it again.
How would you use that or argue that when people say, when everything I Google is that, well, the southern states mostly used it before the Civil War from a southern perspective, and that it ignores the whole general welfare clause of the Constitution? Like, what are your arguments against that then?
Well, I guess I would question what their understanding of the general welfare clause is, because the general welfare clause has been abused to the point that people want to claim that it is, it's almost like this freedom, this carte blanche for the government, to the federal government, to do whatever it wants. It's for the general welfare of the country. Well, no, the general welfare clause is meant that if there's a law passed by Congress, it can't be for the benefit of just one part of the country, one region. You can't have passed some sort of legislation that benefits the Northeast and some more industrial areas, but it harms the South, the more agricultural reliant economy. And that is one thing that the South was seeing leading up to the Civil War, to that war for sure. So they were seeing that there were tariffs that were being put in place that was benefiting the North and was harming the South. So, yeah, that was certainly something that took place. But the general welfare clause is not some special clause there in the Constitution that lets the federal government come up with laws they say are for the general welfare of the U.S. I mean, how many evils have come from that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and that's the problem I found with this whole general welfare clause, is that basically bailouts, trillions of dollars, things that just get pushed through. Because it was for the general welfare of whom?
Yeah,
Who
it's
decides?
not a matter of this is to be for everybody's benefit. It's a protection. It's a protection for showing favoritism towards one part of the country and harming the other.
But we've seen that too. Is not just geographically. I will say the same thing exists even locally, where you can show favoritism to one part of the populace and not the other, regardless of where they live. For example, why are pubs closed? Why are bars closed? We've talked about that before, because some places serve 1% more alcohol than they do food. Oh my gosh, we have to shut them down. Now it's dangerous.
Why can we go share a root beer? We can't share a beer. Yeah,
because then apparently the lack of alcohol makes you safer.
Yeah.
So, and I get that.
Go drink your sugar.
We prefer you to be a diabetic.
Yeah, right.
And I guess that's where I'm going with this, is that everything I've read on this, as I began to discover that it was a formal terminology, really was that. And I was really blown away that, Madison and the Federalist Papers actually addressed the Generalist Clause. He actually addressed these things, saying, look, here's the deal. It wouldn't have been put in there if we've really meant it to be open. And this is the Tony paraphrase version, by the way. He goes on to say, look, this was listed as a restriction. If this was, you look at the context around that clause, it's restricting powers. So it makes no sense that would then be open-ended. You can do whatever you need to. If you feel as a governing body that it's best for everybody, you just enforce it anyway.
Right.
So it makes no sense. But the problem I think we have, though, and we've talked about this before, is that we've got so many people so unfamiliar with it, so unfamiliar with process, control of balance, checks and balances and powers, so unfamiliar with what it takes to become a law that a governor goes out and makes a political gesture, and now that's the way it is.
Yeah.
You know, I had people on our payroll come to me and saying, hey, you know, Trump signed that executive order. Are you going to withhold our payroll tax? No. Why not? Because you'll have to pay it all back at the end of the year. Did you not read that clearly? No. Well, because you've got conflicting things. You've got political gestures. It doesn't mean it just went ahead and fixed all your problems for you. Mm-hmm. And I guess that was where nullification and the idea started to manifest for me, as I realized, okay, you've got these partial political gestures that I think people perceive as nullifying something that the government does, but that's all they are. Whereas true nullification is saying, no, we're holding you accountable to the original agreement,
right?
To the original limitation on anything. I'm not going to let you make a new order that says, oh, we'll temporarily suspend something that I really didn't have a right to do anyway.
Right.
It's saying that you will be limited always and forever at this. And we as a local state, or even more, like you said, more local region, don't have to recognize when you've abused that power. Because, and Tom Woods goes on to quote Madison, he goes on to say, well, what happens if, okay, so we're trying to control the balance of the government at a federal level. Mm-hmm. And the judicial branch and the Supreme Court is a federal level government. So at what point is the federal government going to hold the federal government accountable for not overstepping the grounds that the federal government wanted to overstep as a federal government?
Oh, yeah.
That just seems
that's
so
going to work
stupid.
well.
Yeah. I don't know why all contracts aren't handled that way.
Yeah. This is, like you said, this is an idea that was articulated by Madison and Jefferson. And so this goes back to something that's referred to often as the Principles of 98. You have the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions where Virginia first passed their resolutions and then Kentucky followed. And basically saying, like I said before, Madison stated, hey, it is the duty of the state governments to step in, because there was this defined limitation on the federal government. And once they go past that, if the states don't call them into check, then no one will, and they will grow and they will find more power. I think it's useful to go back and to say, well, maybe that's just one understanding of what the Constitution means. That's one interpretation of it. So like you've said several times, it's important to look at those primary source documents. And so I just want to go over a few quotes from the ratifying conventions, people that were there at that time, and what they had to say about the Constitution and what some of their concerns were.
Yeah, do that, because this was a learning experience for me, even digging into what we're talking about now.
So you've got Madison speaking in Congress. This is April 6th, 1796. And he states that we ought not to look at what the general convention claimed the Constitution meant, but look rather to what the ratifying state conventions believed it meant when they agreed to cede certain authority under it. So if you have a state convention, you have people that are making these arguments about whether or not they're going to ratify the Constitution. That's what matters. It's not the people that are seeking the authority. It's not that position and what they claim it means. It's the people that are agreeing to give up certain authority, to cede certain authority. It's what they believe they are agreeing to. That's what matters.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
So then you have a man named Fisher Ames in the Massachusetts ratification debates. And he points out that the people exercise their sovereignty. And this kind of backs up Madison's point. That's the people exercising their sovereignty by delegating power to their representatives. So had the delegates or servants, as he puts, possessed such authority inherently, there'd be no need for that step of the people delegating power to their representatives. So you start off with the idea that the people have this authority and they are delegating it to these representatives. And then that they if the people were to say, no, we're not ratifying the Constitution, if people in Massachusetts said, nope, we're not ratifying this, Massachusetts doesn't ratify the Constitution, and then it's not bound by it. So obviously that's a display that there's some authority there invested in the people.
Yeah. Okay. So that brings up like 3 points right off the top. And again, for anybody listening, this is a recent formal terminology that I've actually had to start digging into. So you bring up a couple things. Is number one, Massachusetts is not a southern state pre-Civil War.
Nope.
Number two, that means this requires us to look at the authority of the government as a supply chain. Now, I come from a business training and background, business systems and things of that nature. So supply chain is a working that is a negotiated, continually negotiated partnership where to get raw materials and I guess procurement and to produce things and to get all the way through the process to where you finally, wherever your company is at, to handle a final product over to the customer. It's continually negotiated. At some point, you don't want to unbalance the supply chain. You don't want to give too much power to the supplier. You don't want to give too much to the buyer. That was a problem with Walmart, is they started bullying suppliers because as the buyer, they had too much power. And so it's neat the way you talk about the people delegating to the representatives, delegating to the federal government. And so you go from local to state rep to federal, and there's a chain there. And I think that this concept is huge there, that not only is it found in Massachusetts, not only is it found in that kind of chain mentality, but when you look at the anti-federalist papers as well as the federalist papers, when you've got one of the key federalist writers who would be sitting on decision-making later on, I think that's huge when this guy himself, fully aware, primarily being there in person of the context of the meaning of all these words, is making these statements on, hey, these are only granted by the states.
Yeah, and when you're talking about Madison, you're talking about someone who many will refer to him as the father of the Constitution. So, yeah, is it significant? Yes. Is it mean that everything he says is gold? No, absolutely not. It's not to say that this man is some sort of deity that we, he's infallible, not at all. But that's why there's all these other quotes from these other guys that were at these ratification debates, and what did they have to say about it? It's not just a matter of what one guy had to say. It's not just a matter of what one body of appointed judges with lifetime appointments, what they have to say about the matter of federal authority.
Yeah.
But I think that the point that he makes is that don't look to the general government, look back to the people, look back to the states. And then Fisher Ames, he's backing him up on that. And Ames also went on to state that the Senate represented the authority of the states. And this was a sentiment that was repeated at various state conventions. And we have to remember, we're in 2020. Back at this time, when during the ratification debates, the Senate wasn't just, you didn't vote directly for your senators. The senators, that they came from the state legislatures. Those were, that was the 17th Amendment that changed the way that senators were elected. So originally senators were meant to represent the state legislature. So if you had an issue, the state legislature said, whoa, hey, this is harming our state. No, you're done. Come on back. We're getting hurt here. This is not good. You're no longer a Texan. Now you're just part of D.C. You need to come on back to Austin. That's how that was supposed to be originally. Now there's not really a whole lot of difference between the election. I mean, they're elected the exact same as a representative, except now you have two from a whole state. Yeah, you got two guys from Texas that are kind of treated like the representatives. How well does that work?
Yeah,
not too well.
No, not at all. And that's the idea. We've hit upon that so many times talking together, and even here in our little private establishment that's tried to stay running through the whole quarantine. We've talked about it so many times that the fact is that you've got a very centralized, far off government making decisions, but unfortunately the way the process flows now, like you said, let's bring it to a state level. How close are we in our state to our representatives' offices? I mean, we're not. We're just not there. And the idea is, at some point, it's going to happen. What kind of blissful ignorance do we have to be in to realize or to think that, we'll always be fairly represented? We'll always have equal accountability under. No, not at all. I mean, what's the whole point of these social justice things? Is that somebody, the protests and riots, is that somebody feels like they're not equally represented right now. It's just not happening. And at some point we have to go, okay, what is best for us here locally? You know what? Everybody booed Colorado when they began to say, hey, we're going to legalize marijuana. And how many states have followed now? I've lost count.
Right. Yeah, me too.
They're not gonna uphold these ridiculous federal laws anymore because they're like, look, we're spending the majority of our money enforcing laws we don't agree with. Again, that also goes to that whole issue of taking a peace officer from peace officer to law enforcer.
Oh yeah.
And so I'm okay with states dialing that back and saying, no, we're going to invest where it's best for us. You do as you want to do.
Yeah, and that what you said right there, the dialing it back. I think at some point, I looked at all this stuff as the states kind of breaking away from what the federal government was doing as some sort of almost like an act of rebellion, but it's not. And I would say that the American Revolution, it wasn't an act of rebellion because the only rebel that there was the crown. Because you had the rights that the colonists expected as Englishmen. Those were rights that they already had. They were already recognized, and the crown was already becoming despotic and saying, no, whatever I say, that's law. It's not that the law exists and I'm under it. I am law, and I will tell you what law is. That's the way the crown was starting to operate. Where that was contrary to their way of government. And so you had the colonists saying, no, hold on. We're not even getting any representation across the ocean here. And now with our rights are not being recognized, our rights which existed before the crown existed. And so that was the way I started looking at states that were kind of breaking away from the federal government saying, hey, we're doing something different here. Man, it used to be this was... this is a little bit rebellious. No, it's not rebellious. It's saying, like you mentioned before, this is what the agreement was. You're outside of it. There are boundaries to this. Once you're outside of there, I'm sorry, you're not playing the same game. And those acts, they have no authority.
Yeah, and you know what? And that's a great example because that was, like you said, that was your right as Englishmen. And so when we look at this general welfare clause, as well as some of the other 2 or 3 key catchphrases that they like to use when they're just pushing things through. These are people who wrote this, in the state, and we'll just use the context of the span of history, not too long after parliamentarian wars. They had been through, I'm sure they had, it wasn't that far in history, heard about what happened with Cromwell and them when they went through. Well, now Parliament became the totalitarian dictator in England for a while. And so when these limitations are being put on a president and Congress, is because they'd seen abuse by both. It's complete willful ignorance and idiocy to think that, oh no, my government will be inherently good. Oh yes, let's look at history. It's full of people being inherently good and not doing anything bad to each other.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at all of the evils that came about in the 20th century, and who was the main perpetrator? It was the state.
Yeah.
It wasn't a matter of people being evil. It was people acting under the authority of the state.
Which is why you see the church so avid and adamant about separation of church and state. And what's funny is the reason people are upset that it's being completely reversed in this post 20th century interpretation of, oh, that means the church needs to stay out of the state. No. We're saying we want the state out of the church, because when you look at all the atrocities that even they gets blamed on the church, it was because secular leadership was forced upon the church.
Right.
And so, yeah, there's an issue when you look back through history. What kind of willful idiocy do you have to go, oh, well, it's just for the general welfare. They're looking out for me.
Real brief little aside to that is these whole churches becoming 501c3s.
Oh my
gosh.
That
is begging the state to come into the church.
Yes.
That is begging the state to regulate the church.
So I was reading a homeschool place. We talked about it before. The massive homeschoolers in Maine.
Bunch of weirdos.
Yeah. What you mean, like people who want to take responsibility for teaching their own children?
Yeah, man.
Yeah, darn it. And so it was just funny because I have so many that homeschool. We still teach our kids here, even though they attend public school. We also have extracurricular things we teach here, and we all coexist just fine.
Right.
So as a side note, but they were reading, as I was reading today, they were stating the fact that use our forms, not the state's forms. And they go through this, and I went and I checked it out. There's this whole page saying, do not use the state's forms. They exceed the legal requirement. And what happens when you exceed the legal requirement is you invite the state in.
Yep.
Use our forms. They meet
Yeah.
legal requirements and nothing else.
Yes. That's funny because last week I actually had a census taker come out to my house. And he starts asking questions, and I could not for the life of me remember which specific questions. For maybe not everyone knows, you're not required to answer all the questions in the census.
But that's not what the mail-outs say. The mail-outs tell you that, hey, you're required by law to answer the census. Okay. What part? Well, it says the whole thing.
Yeah, that's not true. Because even the guy that came to my house said, look, I know there's ones that I'm not required to answer here. And the guy was nice enough because even he said, okay, there's like 2 or 3 questions. And he said, he gets to certain questions, says, you don't want to provide that information, do you? No, I don't. Okay. And it just moved on.
Because he knows. But
Yeah.
how many people will respond to those because of the general implication of the you have to?
Yeah.
How many times are we told that you have to do this?
Now I'm interested to see what happens because apparently they went to Bob Murphy's house and he said, yeah, no, I'm not. He just declined the whole thing.
Nice.
So it'd be interesting to see what happens with that. I haven't heard of. I know there's people that do that. I haven't heard of what any of the repercussions, if any, there are.
Oh, I know several people who are like, I'm just not responding.
Yeah, but that right there is nullification.
And you know what? And what's this again? Let's put this beneficial facade on it. Well, that's where we get our funding. It takes care of us. You need to respond because it did. No, it's not. There's so much more. It's kind of like what was it? Joe Biden's promise that to hire 100,000 tracers, and when I get elected, we're gonna hire 100,000 people to trace everybody, and so we'll know where everybody's been. Oh yeah, because you're gonna use that for noble reasons. Just like the Patriot Act and everything else that had a noble facade on it.
Yeah, it blows me away to think that people believe that, well, this government's going to be different than every other government that has tried that before.
Yeah.